everyone, and welcome to our channel. My name is Paulo Brito, and I'm a composer of contemporary classical music. And today with me, I have, again, the wonderful soprano Morgan Reid, who is joining me for kind of a fun, we hope, conversation about coloratura sopranos singing Wagner, which is kind of its own tradition, and there's a lot of material to talk about, and it's something that emanates from some of our previous videos about sort of modern and contemporary repertory for coloratura voice and how this pushes the boundaries a little bit of the coloratura voice and what we imagine the coloratura is supposed to be able to do or not do, as might be the case. So if you haven't seen those, I encourage you to check them out. I'll put links below. And otherwise, let's get right into it. In our little intro, you may have heard the famous coloratura soprano Nellie Melba singing the Elsa's aria from Wagner's Lohengrin. And she's singing it in Italian, but we thought we'd sort of start with that because this would be a very early example of a coloratura singing this repertoire, someone who was designated and well known as the coloratura soprano, although it's a little early, and it's possible that, you know, calling her that is a bit pigeonholing and a little bit sort of anachronistic, because we have later, as some of you will know, in the 20th century, the kind of coloratura Fach, which just means a kind of a voice type, developed as a distinct voice type from sort of dramatic and lyric soprano and this kind of thing. Nellie Melba's a little bit early for that. She's kind of on the cusp of that, but because she sang a lot of what we associate as coloratura repertoire, I just sort of put her in there to set the scene, so to speak. Now, one thing that I don't believe Nellie Melba did sing, but that does sort of unify all the four singers that we have here today and whom we will be talking about, is the fact that they all sang the Queen of the Night, which is kind of like the touchstone coloratura role, because it's full of literally coloratura, which is to say sort of fast, virtuosic passage work, which includes legato, kind of scalar and arpeggio sort of passages, as well as staccati. In fact, the very famous second aria of the Queen of the Night has staccatos, reiterated staccati on high C. So this, and of course, they also have a kind of the range of the coloratura, which is they all go up, those Mozart arias go up to high F. So all these ladies sang at some point this Queen of the Night, and then perhaps in many cases at a different point they sang Wagner, which is kind of the opposite because it's associated with dramatic, or at best a kind of a heavy lyric soprano, and a sort of a lower tessitura overall, which is just the kind of the overall range. So I'm going to transfer things over to Morgan also just to set a little bit more of the scene in terms of the kind of the vocal sorts of what's at stake and what's sort of going on. Why are we interested and surprised when these singers take on this repertoire?
I mean, I think one of the things to mention too is within coloratura soprano, there's also different differentiation. So there's dramatic coloratura sopranos and like light coloratura sopranos, or light lyric coloratura sopranos, however you want to kind of call that. A dramatic coloratura soprano is what we would typically say sings Queen of the Night, which, like you mentioned, Wagner and Strauss and some of this bigger repertoire, and all that repertoire kind of leans into that dramatic side. So someone using dramatic coloratura soprano, in some ways it's like, okay, that might make sense. Like the size of the voice, the weight of the voice, the color of the voice will lend itself easily, and then they also have that access to the top. And that's all just, you know, nitpicky things about labels and where things sit and all that. And some people choose to use them. They'll say, yes, I'm a this, I'm a that, and I sing this and all of that stuff. But it's really just to denote kind of color. And I know we talked about that in past videos as well, just kind of what those labels all mean. Sometimes it pigeonholes people. Like, this is what I sing. I only sing the fast high. I only sing Queen of the Night. That's like, and like you mentioned, it's a touchstone, but it's also one that people say, oh, well, that's just like, oh, that's what they do. So they don't always come down. But as you mentioned too, the Wagner sometimes sits lower. It sometimes is sung later in their life, that kind of thing. And the soprano voices, I mean, as we all kind of age and grow, our voices move around, and it might be that they are still considering themselves a soprano, but where they used to sit up at the very top, maybe that's shifted slightly. Maybe, you know, Queen isn't comfortable anymore, but they still have that power and that weight behind the voice. And when I mentioned earlier, I said size, bigger. Mostly that just means, you know, their voice is powerful enough, big enough that it can rival an orchestra. And when it comes to something like the case that we're discussing today, Wagner, the orchestra size is just it's just so large. Not all voices can just carry straight through that. And I mean, without kind of going into the heavy physics of singing, higher voices do have an easier time cutting through an orchestra sound. If we're talking about Queen of the Night, something super high, it'll cut just due to the range of the notes. Now, when we move a bit lower, then that's when you need that sound, just like so much sound that you can hear them through, or they can blend well and all of that stuff. When you think about a dramatic soprano voice, that's someone who has that power behind them. And whether that's a dramatic coloratura soprano or a dramatic lyric soprano or what have you, it's just a little bit of that extra something that kind of gives them that power to be heard.
Talk about Joan Sutherland, who is obviously a very well-known soprano. You could call her coloratura soprano, you could call her dramatic soprano. She's been called all of them. She sang, of course, a lot of the bel canto repertoire, including roles like Norma, which are sort of the kind of, you could call dramatic coloratura. They literally are like heavy roles with a lot of virtuosic passage work. She is not known as a Wagner singer, although she did sing Wagner on stage in her early career. Here we're going to hear her in a recording made relatively late in her career in 1978. This is a Wagner album, actually, of excerpts from operas and mostly things that she did not sing on stage and is not really associated with. We're going to hear just a little bit from Du bist der Lenz, which is Sieglinde's kind of arioso in Die Walküre.
Das Lachen, als hätt ich nie es gekonnt, war was immer mir kann. Doch nicht konnt ich deutlich und klar, als mein Auge dich sah, als du mein Auge.
So I also want to note that this is a studio recording, right? And I sort of emphasize that because we have all of our excerpts today are from studio recordings. And these are all singers who chose to record this repertoire without necessarily singing it live on stage at the same time. They may have sung it previously, they may have sung it later. Obviously, in this particular recording, as in almost all of those that we'll hear, the voice is very present in a way that it wouldn't necessarily be on the stage, no matter what the size, quote unquote, or the volume of the voice is, just because that's the preference for recordings. It's much harder to control, and where the sort of the natural acoustics of live performance are very different.
I mean, I think thinking about it as a studio recording versus even a live recording versus being performed live, they're all a little different, right? Any type of recording can kind of undergo that editing process to amplify the voice, or maybe turn the orchestra down just that.
Oh, it always does, absolutely. Yeah.
And that won't happen in real life, right? And I think that's an interesting thing to point out. Like, we're looking at recordings which may or may not have been edited to various extents, and then yes, in some cases they perform them. Sometimes it was often, sometimes it was later in their career, what have you. But sometimes people record things that they wouldn't think of singing live in context. And I think another example of this too is folks who put things on recital programs with piano, but they would never sing that whole role live with an orchestra. It's more to do a specific aria, an excerpt, something that's going to be like a showcasing moment or a highlighting moment, or like, look at this cool thing I decided to just throw on there, just to kind of even experiment. I know a lot of people do it that way too. And I think that kind of is the thing with the Wagner. It was often sometimes like a very distinct contrast to some of the other repertoire they were singing. But I think Sutherland's a really interesting example of this, and kind of the perfect example of someone who kind of crossed the boundaries of what was expected. And as you mentioned earlier, she was kind of given every label under the sun because she had this kind of powerful, bigger voice, as we say, that was also sometimes impossible to classify just because she had this very narrow, very clear crystal top end, but then all of this sound, like what do you do? What do you do with that? And she was flexible enough that she was able to kind of go through different styles and stuff too. It's not like she was only doing bel canto and then moving into Wagner
Right.
exclusively. She was kind of moving around, and many people also had opinions about that. And I think that's also one of the big things and why we're even talking about it, because it's often something that's controversial. Like, oh, why did they dare to take that on, or why would they even think to record that? But like I said, you can do it, why not?
Well, she liked to experiment actually on record. She actually recorded Turandot. There's a complete recording with her, and which I actually think is quite convincing in many ways. I think with Wagner, the biggest issue is not. I mean, again, these are not singers. I mean, disclaimer: none of us ever heard live. Most of them stopped singing certainly long before Morgan was born. You're really kind of, you're really listening to sort of see, obviously Sutherland sounds like someone on record, but also comparing to her live recordings that were made, from live performance, it sounds like a big voice, and that's what people say. So you have to kind of compare and take all of that in. You have to look at sort of how they. So I would say that Sutherland is a big voice. She certainly, especially in the upper half of her range, is really projecting a lot of volume, and body to that voice. I think the lower half of the range maybe less. I think she did have a very idiosyncratic technique, which in which she kind of didn't really exploit her chest voice. She kind of left it out, and sometimes it was there if she needed it, but it wasn't really something she worked to develop and work into her technique. And she was actually very imitated in that respect by people sort of coming in the subsequent generations. And I think for something like Wagner, that's a particular problem because it tends to lie pretty low. There are high notes here and there, but it really lies low. And so when you're kind of going, a lot of time you're going from the low to mid range and back. And that requires a lot of coordination of a powerful low range to a mid voice that also projects in some way, right? And I think that for her, that's kind of that would be the challenge if we were talking about a live performance. I think it's not so audible here. I think on the recording, she does dip into her chest voice. Here, another thing that's kind of interesting to know for those of you who are familiar with her is that actually I can understand every word she's saying, sort of, amazingly. So again, recording makes things more doable in some ways. In some ways, more scary because you have to be really perfect, right? You can't, I do think this is actually a convincing attempt overall, or whatever you want to call it, like a experiment. Let's put it. And I should also note that we selected these excerpts. All of these singers actually sang pretty much the same excerpts of Wagner. So whether it's Elsa's aria from Lohengrin, Elisabeth's aria from Tannhäuser, which are the earlier Wagner, which tend to suit the lighter voices a little bit better, but they also all recorded, including Sutherland, the Liebestod from Tristan, and Sutherland recorded this excerpt. Some excerpts suit other voices better. We chose to do all different excerpts. So some of these heavier excerpts, like this one from Walküre, it's maybe not the one that Sutherland would shine in the most. Again, I still think that it's very convincing.
And I think just to note too, I think it's also important to realize, kind of as you got into, all of them had different techniques too. And even though they sang similar repertoire, of course, there's going to be differences between the colors of their voices, between the techniques that they used. Some of them might have still preferred to sit a little higher. And it's funny, as a teacher for younger singers, that's often something you see. Someone who likes to sit high, they might not have a fully developed chest resonance yet. They don't really know how to explore that. Sometimes until they're older, sometimes it's always kind of like their weak spot. They're not sure kind of how to find that if they have only preferred to stay up high. And same thing goes vice versa. Folks who only want to hang out in the middle to low sometimes have difficulties finding a true access to the top. Some people might find that's a glorious place to sit and hang out, and they can still go up to the top. And for some people, it might require a little bit more navigation, a little bit more work, a little bit more mental mental games to go through that middle to low section.
So speaking of mental games, we're now going to hear Lucia Popp singing Elisabeth's aria from Tannhäuser, which is actually one of those arias that is probably a little more flattering to a higher voice. It sits quite high overall. Morgan, tell me about mental games, because here we have a coloratura soprano, Lucia Popp. I mean, you know, she became famous in the early to mid 60s singing the Queen of the Night. She sang Queen of the Night on Klemper's recording of the Zauberflöte, the magic flute. She sang when the Met opened with the new Met with the Chagall production. She was the Queen of the Night. So she was a real coloratura. She sang Blondchen, which is the higher role in Abduction from the Seraglio. So one thing that we notice here is that her voice still sounds. This is much later, obviously. This is recording in 1985. Her voice still sounds quite bright overall. It still has that distinctive sound, but when she goes for the high note at the top here, that's almost the most worrisome moment of all. So tell me about this, like, mental that you were talking about, this kind of mental sort of retuning that has to be done to sing for that kind of singer to sing this repertoire.
I think a big part of it is always just where you've been sitting and then where it goes. Like, it's always, and this is kind of a teacher phrase that we hear often, is it's never the high note, it's what comes before it. Like, we know that she has, what is it, a B. That goes without saying. Yes, it was later in her career, but I'm sure she she can sing a comfortable B. So one must assume it has to be what comes before it. So maybe it was that she had to engage different parts of her voice to sing through that middle section, and then kind of abruptly shift as it leaps up. And that's not always the easiest thing. If that's something that's new, if that's something you're still working on, if it's new repertoire, like, once you find something that's really in your body, it's a little bit easier to kind of, you know, go for it. But I wouldn't be surprised if it had a little bit more to do with how it was set up, and also how she was approaching it herself, technique wise and mentally, as opposed to, oh, you know, she can't sing a B.
And that's interesting, because to my knowledge, she didn't sing this on stage or any Wagner. What she did sing, I know, at least in concert, was like the Rusalka, the Dvorak, which may be a little bit closer in sort of feel, and especially for her kind of that very bright timbre. For anybody who knows a little, like, has heard some Czechoslovak singers, this is the, like, Gruberova. Also, they cultivate that a little bit. It's either, you know, and it's very much up to your taste. I happen to like it, particularly in that repertoire, actually, like the Dvorak, Smetana. What do you think about, like, her technical approach? Because that's what you're talking about, worrying about the high note, but overall, sort of her overall sort of like positioning of her voice for this.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned, oh, it's so bright. And I don't think it actually sounds as bright as like earlier recordings from her career. But then you hear another recording of this aria and you go, oh, like the stark difference. Like, her voice still is quite bright. And as you said, in some cases it's a preference. It's not what some people would consider the expected sound when you listen to this aria too. And that's of course where all of those kind of debates lie. But to me, it just kind of sounds like she's working through it in the way that she knows her voice would be able to do it, which is why you're still hearing the brightness. She's not over darkening. She's not changing the whole tone of her voice. It's not like, oh, this is the end of my career and my voice sounds like this now. And it's like such a stark, dramatic shift. So I think she's in many ways staying true to her voice, which is arguably one of the healthiest ways to experiment and stuff, that you're not just going to throw everything away just because you're singing Wagner.
Well, and that's interesting because also that way you're sort of counting on your assets, those assets that you already have. Like in her case, this very bright timbre, fairly kind of on pitch, right? Which all of which helps to project that voice if you don't have the volume, right? Because projection and sort of audibility, all these kinds of things, it's really all manner of different factors that actually contribute to creating that, right? It's not just, do I have big lungs, you know, that like, obviously, and there's difference also between how men's voices project, women's voices project, but generally speaking, all these different factors contribute. And I would say that she has that advantage, at least, of having a voice that, it's very, that really cuts like on top, and in this recording, again, they've lowered the orchestra levels, volume levels, I think unnecessarily, again, also, because it wouldn't sound like that, if you heard it. And I do think that her voice would carry over that, not necessarily like, it would like just hit you with that sound, but I do think that it would still be, audible, and there would be some measure of balance, because that's all you need is balance. You don't have to be louder than the orchestra either, right? You want to hear that too, right? In Wagner especially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the points to just kind of touch on now, and it's already come up twice, and I think what comes up with all of the singers we talk about is this like late career trend of merging into something else. And I kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, but it's extremely common. Now, it's not always Wagner, but sopranos that move around as their voice ages. It might be to Verdi, it might be to Puccini, because with age, oftentimes you do get more of a weight to the sound, a fuller sound. And instead of that like light, flitty, kind of thing at the top. And that, like I mentioned earlier too, their money notes might change a little bit. It might not just always be that high F anymore,
Money.
Yeah. It might be a little lower. They might, as things develop, they might want to sit a little lower. And if they have the sound, if they have the cut, if they have the power, why not move into something like this that's going to challenge you? Oftentimes all of these singers might have still been working with teachers to, recalibrate their technique to kind of take on this new path that they're on. And you see that nowadays too. You'll see singers kind of make a mid-career shift into something else as their voices are growing and as they try on new repertoire, and they do kind of recalibrate with their team, as it were.
We won't go there.